Season 1 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley, Daniel Murphy, and Douglas Dollars, who reminds you to be present, be loving, and that life moves really fast. How does it feel knowing that somebody who in the last decade has wanted to know who Barry Manilow is or Yngwie Malmsteen is has probably read your writing as a critical piece of that knowledge for them?
It's extremely weird.
It never gets normal?
It gets more familiar, but it never gets normal. It's sort of having an audience for your writing is not like, doing a live performance. You don't get how the audience is receiving it. It's just out there in cyberspace, and you have no idea how many people are reading it or what they're thinking when they're reading it, or, how many people there are who like Barry Manilow and Yngwie Malmsteen at the same time. I hope it's more than just me. I think that there's room for, if you like melodramatic ballads, they've both got a few. Barry's got a few more, but
for thousands of people, You've probably told them who Barry Manilow is, and they've gone on to think of everything new they've learned about Barry Manilow is based on perhaps your bio of him. Great responsibility, great power.
I was aware of that when I was writing the Barry Manilow bio, because my thinking was, nobody else really wants to cover this the way that I want to cover this, so it has to be as definitive as I can make it. You do as much research as you can, and you try to make it as objective and as accurate as you can, and you hope that your sources are as accurate as you want them to be. Like for example, if you're going to research the incident a few years ago when Barry Manilow allegedly walked into a wall at his Palm Springs residence, you try to get to the bottom of that, and you can't quite do it, so you finesse it, and you try to make it as accurate as you can and keep your own suppositions to yourself.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, speaking today at the top of a hill where you'll find Barnsdall Art Park, overlooking the Los Feliz Hollywood type area. Speaking today with Steve Huey, whose writing you have almost certainly read if you have looked up major artists or made a practice out of that on the All Music Guide, because he wrote for them for a long time, and his contributions remain there. If you look up, as we said, Yngwie Malmsteen or Barry Manilow or Michael Jackson, you'll see Steve's writing. You'll probably have seen him if you're at all familiar with the late 70s era of Southern California studio musicians who contributed to albums from the likes of Toto, Steely Dan, Hall & Oates, on the series Yacht Rock, the web series, the only thing in the world I've ever wished I thought of, the early adventures of all these bands. And artists like Kenny Loggins was a main antagonist, Michael McDonald kind of the hero of the show. Steve Huey was Hollywood Steve, the presenter of that show, as they would say across the pond. And he's been on VH1's Top 100 countdowns of various things. It's fair to call him a media personality as well as a music writer. Now, it's been a good 10 years since you've regularly written for the All Music Guide, right? So it's not just you who's introducing Barry Manilow, it's you of a decade ago, right? And how does that feel?
That's even weirder, and that's the editor in me really. I really want to go back and change some of the writing, because my perspective on certain things has changed over time, and some of the writing just it's clearly beginner's writing. It's not up to the standard that I would have right now, because I'd like to think I've gotten better over time with practice.
And I've read you joined the All Music Guide in 1994. Is that correct?
That is correct. That was my summer job after my freshman year of college. The company was based in my hometown. Stephen Thomas Erlewine, who you've probably read if you've ever looked up anything on the All Music Guide. I went to high school with him.
I assumed he wasn't a real person, just like a hive mind. We're going to write under this name, Stephen Thomas Erlewine, and we'll write about everything from the Beatles to Aaron Carter, and it's all going to be under this guy's name, but we're actually 45 people, no?
No, he is that prolific. He eats, breathes, and sleeps criticism.
Well, I mean, was that at the time as well your aspiration? This is a summer job, but maybe I'll eat, breathe, and sleep criticism as well for a while?
For me, I think it was more that I ate, slept, and breathed music for a long time. Criticism wasn't necessarily an aspiration, but it was, I kind of fell into this job. Because let's be honest, if you were a weirdo growing up in my hometown, you found your way to this company sooner or later.
And that hometown was where?
This was Big Rapids, Michigan.
Not to be confused with Grand Rapids, right?
No. Big Rapids is an hour north of Grand Rapids, and you can't see this on the podcast, but I'm pointing at my hand, using my hand as the map of Michigan. It's
a common form of, yeah.
And it's right up here at the base of the ring finger, approximately.
You're about 200 miles out of Detroit at that point as well?
3.5 hours,
okay.
However, whatever distance that is.
About 200 miles, I think. And so the All Music Guide is based there then. So if you're a music nerd...
Actually, it's no longer based there.
It was. Is in the sense that in 1994, it's based there. And if you're a music nerd in Big Rapids, that's kind of where you're going, right?
Yeah, and there weren't very many of us, so they ended up moving the company down to Ann Arbor in 1998 or 99, just because they were looking for more knowledgeable help. And they were able to sort of draw in a lot of the local record store clerks to fill out the ranks and increase the staff.
I think of that, and I don't know why. I've never been to that area of the state, but I think of it as the Ann Arbor type area as kind of a music geek, if not mecca. There's a lot of them there, right, in Ann Arbor? I mean, it's does the area cultivate a kind of musicophilic or rockophilic, whatever you want to call it, sensibility?
I think in some ways, yes, because it's kind of it's the one really, really strongly liberal hippie kind of enclave in Michigan that I can think of. Detroit has a reputation as being pretty liberal, but it's a very different vibe in Ann Arbor. But Ann Arbor also has sort of the history behind it as being the place where, the MC5 and the Stooges back in the day that was their stomping ground. So you've got the pedigree, and then you've also got the cultural vibrancy. Lately, actually, I think around the time when I moved out here around the turn of the millennium, there was a big Detroit techno revival. Like, people were embracing that as part of the musical history of the area, and there were DJ clubs springing up, and that was turning into more of a scene. There were more underground labels doing Detroit-style electronic music.
Now, as a music lover and somebody from Michigan, give me your take on the general assumption that in Detroit, not only is there no music anymore, there's nothing at all. Is that true, or is that just a popular assumption we can correct here?
Well, I mean, you had the White Stripes, maybe the best rock band of the last decade, coming out of Detroit, and there was kind of a garage rock revival scene there. I don't know what's going on right now. I haven't been back in a long time, but there are still not very many jobs in Detroit. There's a lot of empty space in Detroit, and it's become sort of a selling point for people who want to go explore, say, dangerous old buildings and just wander around in unsupervised space. It's kind of...
Or buy a $5,000 mansion while you're out there.
Yes, I think there's a definite appeal to having a $5,000 mansion, as long as it's not going to fall apart on you and you're not going to get robbed.
If your job is urban ruin explorer, I mean, there you go. There's no better place, but it doesn't seem to now be the cradle of music styles. Perhaps it has been before.
I wouldn't say right now. It probably isn't right now. I'm trying to think what I do know that is going on there, and I haven't been there in so long. I've totally lost track.
Now, when you're the young music nerd getting hooked up with the All Music Guide, how long is it before they're saying, Huey, tell the world who Michael Jackson is?
Well, it takes a long time to earn enough trust to be able to tell the world who Michael Jackson is. So when you're starting off, you're gonna hear things more like, Huey, nobody on staff likes Ozzy Osbourne. Tell the world about Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman.
So you could write about well-known things, but they couldn't be well-liked things among music nerds.
There is a definite pecking order. You have to prove yourself as a writer, and you have to prove your breadth and depth of knowledge over time before you can get the more plum assignments. But if for example, if they knew you were really, really, really into a particular artist and you were kind of the most into that artist on the staff, they would try and spread it around a little bit so that, you know, people were getting the writing assignments they really, really craved and were happy.
Now, tell me a little bit about I guess the way that working at that kind of operation, I don't know if I'm going to ask whether the way it shaped your musical consciousness or the way you were able to sort of impose your musical consciousness on it. What's the more appropriate question to ask about that?
The first one, because I can tell you right now that nothing that I did imposed my musical consciousness on that place. I started off as the heavy metal guy because I happened to be the one person in the office who liked it. And the running joke around the office early on was someday we're going to publish the Steve Huey Guide to Shit Rock. I think that was after I volunteered to review Typo Negative.
That seems like there could be a market for that book. I mean, what did they consider?
I really think they missed the boat on this one, I got to tell you.
Now, what did you see in the music that they were deriding so badly? What would be your argument to them that this indeed was not shit rock? This was something else entirely, and I can show you what it is.
The way I would answer that question is, what am I seeing that they're not? I think it just kind of is testosterone. And if you're not into testosterone, I mean, some of it goes a long way for me, but if you don't vibe with that, you're not going to be argued into it. I think that depends so strongly on how your own gut works that either you hear it and you go, yeah! Or you hear it and you're like, what the fuck is this shit? I don't need to own this or hear it ever again.
Is there any arguing somebody into liking or at least being open to a certain type of music or band or something you love, an album, say, that they will insist is terrible, or is that just like they got to come to it, you can't do anything? What lessons have you been taught over time in regard to that?
We were talking earlier about Stephen Thomas Erlewine's extreme prolificness. I don't think that's a word, but I'll use
prolificacy
it anyway.
Maybe as well. I don't know. I'd toss it up.
Colloquially, it's fine. I think the common denominator in a lot of his wide-ranging tastes is craft. It's the way that he can cover the Beatles and Sonic Youth and Aaron Carter and give a good review to the Paris Hilton album, which he took a lot of flack for on the internet, where he's not listening to all the trappings, he's listening to the craft in the music. How well constructed is it? How memorable is it as music? Does it stick with you after you're done hearing it, or is it just not very good music on a purely sonic level? And I think that in terms of hooking people on a genre that they're maybe not open to, I think that's the same thing that we did with Yacht Rock, is people look at the trappings of that music. Oh, it's not raw and exciting. It doesn't kick ass. America's a nation of ass kickers, and that music does not kick ass at all. The artists don't exactly have the most hip images, or at least they didn't at that time. And so there's none of the traditional selling points of American music are really there. But what it does have behind it is craft. It's very memorable music. It's melodic. There's a lot of depth to the arrangements. So there's new sonic details you can pick out of the arrangements, even if you're hearing it for the 20th time. And the more that you hear that craft is a gateway towards acclimating yourself to the way that music feels. It's because it's good music, eventually it can make you feel the way that the music itself feels. Let me just say that the brain trust at the All Music Guide was pushing Yacht Rock style music on me years before I was ready to accept it.
Your reaction was like, just pass this along down the line to somebody even less senior than me in the organization, or what? Or did you just have to suck it up and write about it?
We were subjected to it whether we wanted it or not. There was the early days, we all worked in kind of a common area, that there were workstations spread around over a big room in a converted house, and whatever the top two editors wanted to hear, that was what got played on the stereo, and you could tune it out with your own headphones, or you could try, but if they were really in the mood for Steely Dan, you were going to hear Steely Dan, and you were going to hear it for the next 4 weeks.
Sure.
And then they would change it up with some Christopher Cross, and the cry would come up from around the office. You know, that Steely Dan that you were playing the last 3 weeks, that sounds really good. Maybe you should switch back to that Steely Dan.
Maybe you can get the Royal Scam back on the turntable and get sailing off of it. Yeah, that's so. About this genre, yacht rock, the sort of retroactively defined genre that this web series made so many delightful adventures out of. You know, these bands. I listened to many of them in high school, trying to catch up on yacht rock before I knew what yacht rock was, because it did seem like what you just said. You know, Steely Dan they were clearly a cut above just on the surface to listen to them, but then, you know, a band like Toto or a guy like Christopher Cross or a Hall & Oates, it did seem like whatever was going on in the late 70s, that the equivalent, the people listening, if you take the audience for yacht rock in the late 70s and you take that same audience or the equivalent in the 90s or in the modern day, they're still listening to music. It doesn't seem like it does have that craft element. I mean, there's no yacht rock today properly defined, is there?
No, there really isn't pop music being made for grown-ups. I think the closest you come to that is contemporary country, which is in some ways barely country anymore. But that's really the only music that's being marketed to grown-ups anymore. And I think it's just been this narrowing of the record industry where they don't know how to sell anything but prepackaged pop, and they want to make these massive investments and have them pay off. So that's the only thing that they've tuned the machine to know how to do. With yacht rock, you had this sort of pop music for grown-ups that didn't need to be marketed with image, or you didn't necessarily have to connect with the people making the music. You didn't have to be sexually attracted to them. You didn't have to think, oh, these guys are hip and edgy just like me. It wasn't about projecting this self-image. It was just well-crafted music that sounded good when you were done with your day at your shitty job, or you were out sailing on your yacht, or whatever it is you were doing as a grown-up in that time.
Grown-up activities of that era.
Yes, exactly. We were talking about craft. There aren't so many places to go where you can write songs over and over and over and over again. There's much less of a professional songwriting industry now because there aren't as many popular artists being marketed, and there aren't as many bands who can, you know, if you have a bunch of like 30-something guys who say, let's form a pop music band because we're all good at writing and performing pop music, you can't really do that anymore. You can't.
Being good at it isn't quite enough?
You know, being good at it isn't quite enough because nobody has enough imagination to market it anymore. You almost have to be in the celebrity tabloids for anybody to be interested in your pop music, because it isn't seen as... the music isn't seen as an end in itself. It's just seen as one arm of an overall marketing campaign.
Well, what were the marketing geniuses doing in 1978 when yacht rock was selling and things were, in the mind of the labels, the gears were turning nicely?
I think radio was a lot more important at that time, and if you had something that sounded good on the radio, it didn't matter what you looked like or what kind of image you were projecting nearly as much. The conventional wisdom is that MTV killed Christopher Cross's career because once you put that guy on TV, it just didn't really connect with people nearly as well. But I mean, now
in his appearance, you can't even describe. He just sort of fades into the background. He's just the most average-looking fellow there is, and not a freak. And so he was unsuccessful in MTV terms because of his non-freakishness.
He was. Yeah, that's the best way to put it. He was just a really average-looking dude, and that wasn't the way you marketed things anymore after MTV came out.
Surprised nobody put him in a checkerboard suit or something. Just kind of tried to fake it for a while.
They may have. I'm not. I can't. I haven't gone and watched any of the old Christopher Cross music videos. There may.
He didn't have the whole flamingo thing.
I don't even know which ones exist, to tell you the truth.
Right.
I feel like there have to be some horrible marketing blunders in there somewhere. I'll probably go home and look at it. Try and look that up.
Now, I get the sense that when music writers get into the music writing game at first, with a sheer passion for music, and that when you're very young, it expresses itself in, I love this band, I hate this band, I love this player, I hate this player, a very stark division of the musical world into what you love and what you hate. And I get the sense that the more music writing one does, the less important loving and hating becomes. It becomes about something else. Do I have that at all right in your case? Was that your trajectory, or is that, how true is that image to the sort of music writing, music criticism field?
When you start out, you have to start out writing about things you love. And because anybody can just shit all over everything. I don't think that's criticism. That's just, whatever it is, it's not real, honest to God, helpful criticism. Always the rule at the All Music Guide offices was, if you hate something, you're allowed to write a bad review, but it can't just be subjective. You have to actually analyze and explore why you hate this. Why is it bad? You have, and it forces you to become articulate about why things work and why things don't work. Why you love this, but why you don't like this. And I think that's the hardest part for any critic starting out is to be able to articulate those deeply irrational emotions that music draws out of you. Is, well, okay, you love Blizzard of Oz, but why is it awesome?
Right. And expressing that without just cloaking your impulse that it's awesome in a lot of terms you think sound more technical. You know what I mean? Like, that's a stage you got to go through too, right?
Right. You can't just come up with 10 synonyms for awesome and make that your review. It does help to know something about how the music is put together, but technical terms only go so far with a lay audience, and you just have to kind of know, like, where did this come from? What is it trying to do? How well does it accomplish what it's trying to do? What are some examples of things that are trying to do this same thing that don't work as well? Why don't they work as well? You have to expand the breadth of your knowledge. You have to hear what's bad in order to know what's good sometimes, too, I think.
Does it all come down to this sort of element of the Stephen Thomas Erlewine type perspective where it all comes down to some music has high craft, some music is bad at being crafted, some music is lazily crafted, and it just becomes irrespective of content at a certain point. Some music is well crafted, some isn't, and at a certain point you've just got to talk about the craft?
I mean, I think there's more to it than just craft, but I think that craft is the gateway into whatever that music is trying to make you feel. You listen to a Stooges album, those songs are generally not well crafted, but there's enough musicality there that it will draw you in if you listen to it enough. The parallel I want to draw is with telling a story, just like with music, having musical craft and then emotional content as well. You do the same thing with a story. There's good and bad storytelling technique, and there's good and bad story content. You can have a really well-structured story, but it can be boring as shit. And you can do the same thing with musical craft. You can have all sorts of lovely little melodies and arrangement touches, and those will draw people in, but for something to be really, really lasting, it has to have some kind of emotional content. And also, it goes the other way, too. It's difficult to have very raw emotional content but not know what the hell you're doing on your instruments.
Right.
The best stuff, there's kind of a meeting between the musicality and the emotion that not only does it draw you in, it kind of keeps you there.
It seems like, from hearing that, the hardest challenge for a music writer would then be to describe why something is boring. You know, when you're on your 100th album that you don't quite like, trying to describe the boringness of it. I mean, is that some circle of music writers' hell, or does that become its own interesting task?
If you're on your 100th boring album of the week, you're going to run out of ways, because there are only so many things you can blame. After a while, you're going to fall back on the songwriting is underdeveloped. Because often that's what it boils down to, is the songwriting is underdeveloped. The melodies are not... They haven't revised the musical content enough to make these songs that are going to stick with you, unless you've heard them 100 times. And even if you hear a boring song 100 times, you're probably still not going to carry it away with you, because there isn't enough there. Whatever patterns they're creating are not patterns that are going to stick in the area of your brain that processes that information. Part of what led me away from music criticism, like I want to do something else for a while, is there are really only so many things you can say about uninteresting music. There are only so many culprits for that. Well, you're never going to get to review everything you like, but when you get to the point where you're not writing enough about things you really love that have stood the test of time, then there's a chance you can lose interest and want to move on somewhere else. And I think that's what happened with me, is there were only so many ways I could even write about good music. And there's a challenge in trying to do that, again and again, day in and day out. But if you have other interests, then you're probably going to go... Like, I wanted to know what made other stuff tick, too.
And how far a leap away from music is that, to know how other stuff ticks? I mean, is that a complete starting from square one on the other stuff? Or knowing how music ticks, does that help figure out the other stuff in life?
Well, I think for me, I was always interested in writing, but I always pictured myself as more the creative writer. Like, not... When you're a music critic, your writing is basically dictated by the content of somebody else's work. Unless you're a Lester Bangs type who you just launch into wild free associations of whatever this music makes you think about at the moment. And most critics who do that are not Lester Bangs. I always felt like it was my job as a critic to stick fairly closely with what the music was giving me and evaluate that. And eventually I wanted to go make up my own stuff. Like I alluded to earlier, if you're trying to figure out what makes a story tick, the more you learn about the craft of storytelling, the more parallels you can see with music. You can look at a Motown song and go, oh, there's a story happening, there's a turning point there in the lyrics, and there's an ironic wrap-up in the third verse, and it mimics decent story structure at the same time. You can also look at the way that the songs are musically put together, and look at the details, and look how the technique mixes with the emotional content in the stuff that really works well, and go, that's what you're trying to do with a story.
And how important across these fields is it to know the bad examples well, like we were talking about? You have to hear the bad music to know the good. You have to read the bad music criticism to know how to write better music criticism. To some extent, have to write the bad stuff yourself, I suppose. And you have to read the bad stories to know the good ones, right?
Yeah, you absolutely have to know what's bad, because you start to learn all the different flavors of badness. And you start to watch out for those in your own work. Like, let's say there's a work of genius that combines all these disparate influences from different things to create something that's really fresh and new, because it's drawing from so many other sources that have never been combined in quite this way before. And then you see the influence that work has on its own imitators, where the imitators are drawing from a much smaller palette of influences, and they're imitating things that they liked about these one or two or three works. And sometimes you can see the creation of a new genre from that, like aspects of this genius work sort of form into this other recognizable genre with its own rules. maybe the original work was breaking all the rules and then creating its own new set. And you can go to that new genre and say, okay, these guys did it well because they brought their own spin to it. These guys were just sort of repeating these things they liked without much of their own spin until those things kind of hardened into cliches that have become overly familiar.
It reminds me of that quote that every great work either founds a genre or dissolves one. I mean, what are some of your really striking memories of genre-breaking work in whatever form that you've encountered that made you think that really accomplished something that really broke a genre? Let's just say that.
One of the big ones for me was Nirvana's Nevermind on the musical side, because that was something that when Nirvana got big, they would start bringing up all these influences of theirs, and they were so wide-ranging. And even there may not have been a tremendous amount of variety in Nirvana's sound itself, but you could see where all these different sensibilities had kind of filtered into their work, and you could go back and listen to these original sources and think, I can see how that influenced them. I can see how that other thing that sounds completely different influenced them. You look at a lot of the bands who imitated Nirvana and the other grunge bands, and that kind of genre is still going today, but it all sounds very much the same to me. It's long since hardened into a cliche. It's its own genre. There are some bands who do it better than others, but there's very little fresh happening right now. And when Nirvana came out, also, there was not a whole lot of punk and indie type hard rock making its way into the mainstream. Like, this is the first time that a lot of people had heard music like that, and it appealed to the sensitive indie kids, and it appealed to the people who were being raised on hard rock and heavy metal, who wanted some testosterone in their music too, and had never heard anything that was quite that raw and unhinged and had that kind of emotional release to it at the same time as being good, well-crafted music. Because when Nirvana came out, it was the hard rock landscape was, hair metal bands who were good for MTV, and the highly technical thrash bands like Metallica, who they were excellent musicians, but there was a definite tightness to their music because it was so intricate that it was not easily replicated, and you couldn't get too wild trying to play that yourself because there was so much to it.
Nevermind, that's over 20 years ago now, and people seem to think that...
No, it's not. It can't be.
Okay, it can be, and yet, whatever amount of time it was ago, if it was 1 year ago, no matter, people still seem to say that we're never going to see an album with that kind of cross appeal again. Like, the days are over when something genuinely interesting can reach a lot of people at once musically. Do you think that's true? Do you think there's a reason for that to be true?
It's hard to say, because music has become... There's a lot more fragmentation. There's a lot more niche genres that there just seems to be very little cross-pollination. But at the same time, you can have a band like the White Stripes come out who have really studied their different influences and have worked very hard at their songcraft, and who have that classicist command of songwriting technique, but who at the same time are drawing from a lot of different sources. And and it's hard for me to say how many people the White Stripes really reached. I feel like they're big, but at the same time, I might be so far in the music nerd ghetto that I've completely lost touch with the reality of most everyday Americans. I really don't know. But it may just be that's going to shift to different artists. I mean, I think back to when Outkast had their big breakthrough. It seems like just a few years ago. I think it was probably about 2003, 2004. When you look at what Outkast had done, they had a very solid track record of very inventive, eclectic music that built an audience gradually over time. And as the word started to filter out that, hey, these guys are doing really great, interesting work. They happened to come out with something that really captured the popular imagination with, the Hey Ya and The Way You Move singles. They just hit at the right time. That was a case where really good music was finding a really wide audience among lots of different fan bases at the same time. But you can debate still, like, is that even possible 8 years down the road? Just how is music getting out nowadays? And I feel like even just in the past few years, with the genres that are still creatively vital right now, that there's been a downturn in the number of, like, really good underground hip-hop albums that have been coming out. There's been a downturn in the number of indie rock bands that really hit on a really strong level, even with their core audience. I feel like there is less critical consensus about what is really good right now. If I go and read the Village Voice, Paz and Jop end of the year record geek polls, the winner this year was an album that I'd never heard of, and a lot of people had never heard of. You know, it's one thing to have the Arcade Fire win a Grammy for, what was it, Best Album, I think it was?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, it's one thing for a big indie rock band to win a Grammy and have a bunch of pop fans going, who the hell are these guys? But it's another thing to have an indie rock record win a major critics poll and have a lot of critics going, who the hell are these guys? I'm a huge music nerd, and I have never heard of Tune Yards, or I've never heard that record. I didn't know about it. Yeah. So, I think it's an era where something can come out of nowhere and make an impact, but how wide of an impact is it going to be? I think it really depends on where you can go to hear that music. If there's a big centralized place where you can go, like the radio or MTV or that song in that iPod commercial,
sure,
your chances are greatly improved of having good music hit on a big level thanks to the exposure. But I think there are so many fewer places that are willing to give new, inventive music that kind of exposure that people are going to have to hunt it up on their own. And the older you get, the less time you have to start hunting stuff up obsessively on your own. You need those centralized locations to go and find out what's good. What should I be listening to that I missed out on?
Now, does living here in Los Angeles, the entertainment production capital of the U.S., compound that whole sense, that notion that there's just too much? Or does it even matter with the geography?
I think with the internet, it matters less about the geography because you can keep up on a lot of things without ever leaving your own apartment.
For good or ill.
For good or ill. Living in the entertainment capital of the world and trying to work in the entertainment industry, you just get a lot more sense of the business side of things, that it doesn't really matter what's in the product as long as the product is moving. You can get that sense that there is too much anywhere because the internet puts a lot of things at your disposal. You can look up information on any band you want, any show you want, any director, whatever.
The All Music Guide was my way as a high school student, pre-Wikipedia especially, to look up bands.
And I'd just like to point out that Wikipedia usually uses us as confirming sources for a lot of
That's why I say
material.
When they read about Barry Manilow, they're reading you, probably, even if they go to Wikipedia.
Yeah, and that's the thing is Wikipedia, you have to cite something, and it's generally on the internet, so even if our website itself doesn't have the reputation that it used to, between licensing our database and constantly being cited on Wikipedia, our information is still getting out there pretty widely. But I just think the more that you investigate anything that you're into, whether it's any cultural area that you're interested in, music or movies or TV or whatever, there's a ton of crap out there to sift through. But the more research you do, the more really great stuff you're going to find. And just taking in all of the great stuff is almost impossible in a lifetime, because the more research you do, the more of it you find, and there's just only so many hours in the day that you have to be entertained.
Yes. That should be a heartening thing, but it's strangely disheartening in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, the people who... You eventually learn that the people who complain that there's nothing good out there are not looking very hard.
I can't imagine anybody doing that anymore, though.
People still do it, and it's because they're not looking very hard, because they're not... And I think partly it's because they don't know where to go look. But once you find those gateways, like the AllMusic Guide, for example, you can just go browse around and find it, because the internet is set up that way to lead you down all sorts of different paths that you would not have found otherwise. But yes, the alternate is there is so much out there that you will never take it in. I have, because I've concentrated on music for so long, there's some very large, unreasonable gaps in my movie viewing experience. And apparently it's now outdated to still keep a Netflix queue for DVDs, but I still do that.
I do too. And, I think people just don't talk about it. They're doing it, though.
Yeah, I think, DVDs, that's so old, but I don't like their streaming service, and there's no other way to see everything, so I'm just going to keep that. But I tried to keep up on current movie reviews, because I was really going to keep up and know what was going on right now. And then I was going to go back and watch all these great TV series that I missed when I was working night shift or not paying attention or whatever. And I was going to go back and watch all these classics and all these great directors and all the foreign art movie directors that everybody in film school loves. And what I found is that I had to create alternate Netflix queues for imaginary family members that I made up, because Netflix allows you to create queues for family members. So there were too many movies. I look at my Netflix. There are like 5 Netflix queues for me and my imaginary family, and I can watch one of these discs a day, and I'll still be watching probably until I'm 50.
You get a good 500 per queue, right? I mean, it gets up there.
You get 500 per queue, and I've got one that's pretty much full with the last 10 years. I just pretty much stopped reading movie reviews because I was never going to get through 2004 even.
You're going to have to surrender the compulsion to keep up with anything. Like, keeping up is now not what you can best do. Or keeping up or even filling yourself completely in. You have to sort of accept, I'm going to try hard, but there's also going to be a lot of randomness in this search, right?
Yeah, there's going to be randomness, and there's going to be holes no matter what. There's always going to be somebody around who can say to you, "You've never seen that?" And
it makes you not want to be that guy. That's for sure. Whenever I hear somebody say that, it's like, never again will I give somebody a hard time for not having seen or more so heard something.
Even as huge a music nerd as I am, there's always going to be something that somebody can say, "I can't believe you've never heard that, and I have. I've beaten you at your own game, Hollywood Steve."
Yes. And when were you anointed with the name Hollywood Steve?
That was a name that was given to me by Yacht Rock's co-creator and writer-director J.D. Riznar. It was back in, I think it was 2003. I had been looking for, when I first moved out to Los Angeles, I continued to freelance for the AllMusic Guide because I had no job here. And I was looking for alternate ways to earn an income that were more local and didn't require me to sit in my apartment 40 hours a week, not interacting with anybody.
Yes.
And my roommates at the time were doing extra work, and I heard about, there's this movie coming up that they're looking for skinny guys with long hair and character faces, which is Hollywood's way of saying weird looking without insulting you. And they need these people to be pirates on the Disney Pirates of the Caribbean movie. So I went and I tried out for that, and they took me. So I'm an extra in the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie.
Were you in a room with a bunch of skinny, long-haired guys, just all sort of hanging out?
Yes, I was one of the youngest ones there, too, because a lot of the guys that they got were more towards middle age, and they're more your typical California long-haired dudes. Yes, we would go into rooms that had, great big cave sets or giant fake boats built in, I think it was that dome down by the Queen Mary where they built one of the pirate ship sets. And that's the one scene where you can actually see me in the movie is on one. I think it's the scene where Keira Knightley is brought on board the bad guy's pirate ship for the first time, and you can see me in the background looking over somebody's shoulder at the hot girl. And I'm in heavy makeup, so my own mother didn't recognize me. We had to buy the DVD. We saw it in the theaters with her multiple times. She didn't pick me out. We finally bought the DVD. They also had to buy my parents a DVD player in order to play the DVD. And then we had to pause the DVD and use the zoom-in feature.
Yeah, you had
to
zoom.
Walk up to the TV and point it. That's me right there, and that doesn't look like you.
Not a rewarding moment, ultimately.
Well, it was rewarding when I got paid money to do that. That was that was all right. And I got a SAG card out of that. Mm-hmm. And so, bringing it back around, I was an extra in a pirate movie, and I got a SAG card out of it. That's the Screen Actors Guild for the lay people out there who don't work union in
Industry
Hollywood.
lingo.
We're throwing out the jargon here. And so I was hanging out with JD and some of the other future Yacht Rock folks at that time, and JD would just go, "Oh, hey, there goes old Hollywood Steve and his Hollywood success," because clearly being an extra on Pirates of the Caribbean was the pinnacle of
well on your way
Hollywood success that could be achieved. And then eventually JD was working a low-paying job at a reality TV company, as many of us do in Hollywood to start out. Some of us graduate to higher-paying jobs in reality TV companies. Right. But JD wound up getting me a job there because the freelance gravy train was starting to dry up. And he would just introduce me around the office. "Oh, this is my friend Hollywood Steve. You should work with him." And it kind of caught on, and I would get paged over the loudspeaker at this workplace. "Hollywood Steve, call 222. Hollywood Steve, 222. And the other people around the company, "Who the hell is Hollywood Steve?" And people would find out that it was me, and they would look at me and go, why do they call you Hollywood Steve? And I didn't feel like explaining it, so I'd just say, "Isn't it obvious?" and walk away. If you've never seen me, I don't look anything like a Hollywood person. But yeah, it just kind of caught on. And then when JD did Yacht Rock and picked me to host it, because I was a music critic and had a SAG card at that point, like,
double threat.
I should use this guy. This is Hollywood Steve. Everybody knows this is Hollywood Steve. That's just who it is.
And when I first watched Yacht Rock, this was a few years after the peak of my using AllMusic to catch up on artists I didn't know anything about. I was like, Steve Huey, I know who that is. I was shocked to see that it was the same guy I had read on AllMusic. And I assume other people have had the same moment as well. I don't know. Actually, now that I think about it, I was going to say I don't know how much the overlap was between AllMusic readers and Yacht Rock viewers, but it's probably a pretty heavy overlap. Now that I think about it,
it's all on the internet.
It's all the internet, but Yacht Rock fans seem to be people who by virtue of being born a little too late, needed to go on AllMusic to know what Yacht Rock was, right?
Yeah, because that radio format was really dying out, too. It was, like we talked about, there was less catering to adults and adult tastes and adult money, because all the conventional advertising was, you have to go for the younger demographic that has more disposable income, even though most of them have shitty low-paying jobs. But advertising wisdom.
Sure.
It's if you were born too late, you didn't get to hear that kind of music in the offices of local businesses and dentists, across the country. The local Big Rapids radio station at the time, they would cater to both demographics. They would have basically adult contemporary / yacht rock playlists during business hours, and then when it was quitting time, they would switch to white trash rock and roll.
The changeover was just stark and immediate.
It was immediate, and it was great. Now they switched to country, which also serves the market demographic, but it's much more predictable, and there's less local character involved.
Now, you mentioned these shitty part-time jobs people will have, especially below a certain age, and it's especially true, it seems, here in Los Angeles, here in Hollywood. People, and I mean, I include myself in this, we all tend to make livings in obscure, fragmentary ways we can't quite explain. I mean, what kind of environment does that make this city for you as a place to live and work? I mean, I feel like now I've been long enough without working a real job, a regular job. I wouldn't know how to go back to it. But what do you think about that sort of Los Angeles under middle-aged person who is into various forms of art and media lifestyle? Does that make any sense?
I think so. I think for me, what's difficult is I grew up in a very stable household where my dad had a job and he went to his job every day. And he was a tenured professor, so he was going to keep his job unless something horrible happened. And when you work in the entertainment industry, those very stable gigs are very hard to come by in a lot of cases. Even when you are past your younger years, it's a very different kind of way to support yourself and eventually try to raise a family in a city with a very high cost of living. Part of me is still not used to that. I've been a freelancer, and I've been all too frequently a night shift worker because there's a lot of jobs in reality TV, and if you know what you're doing on a computer, you can eventually figure out how to get paid more money than you've ever made as a freelancer. Let's just say that.
A relative fortune compared to the freelancing fortune.
It's it tends to disappear fairly quickly in a city like this. I know when my old neighborhood, which is right around here, the Barnsdall Art Park, a few years before I moved in there, you could get a studio or one-bedroom apartment for $450. This was just around like the year 2000. When I moved in, I got a one-bedroom for $750, which was still a pretty good price then. Now the one-bedrooms in this area are renting for, you're lucky to get a studio for $1,000. You can maybe pay $1,200, $1,400 for a one-bedroom. Parking is a crapshoot, and just the cost of living has gone up so much, even just in the last 10, 12 years, that it's harder and harder to make a living and live the way that you're used to living before you move to this city. So I really feel like there's a fire lit under my ass to go and work and make sure I can not end up out on the street or with 4 roommates again.
Sure, but the lavish Ann Arbor lifestyle is not something that can be accomplished here in Los Angeles, then.
For Michigan, Ann Arbor has a fairly high cost of living. I think I was paying... What I was paying for a studio apartment there was about what I could have paid for a studio apartment in L.A. had I chosen to live in a less comfortable neighborhood. There's a definite step up in terms of what you are going to pay to survive, even moving from Ann Arbor to L.A. You will pay for the privilege of living in Ann Arbor, but you will pay more for the excitement of living in L.A. and being that close to everything.
Right, there's no $5,000 mansions in either Ann Arbor or Los Angeles, of course. It's no Detroit, but it's...
Few things are.
True. We can always point to Manhattan and say, well, at least it's not like that, where people are paying $1,000 for a studio shared with 3 other people, right?
Right. And in L.A., you don't need an apartment broker to go hunt down an apartment for you. You can still find an apartment in LA by yourself.
Right.
You don't have to pay somebody else. Well, usually you'll have to pay $60 to Westside Rentals and get an account on that site and go looking for things. But you may find an apartment on Craigslist for free, and
that's what I did.
Then your $60 for Westside Rentals seems like a waste.
Just to hit the Barry Manilow bio one more time.
Please do that.
Yes.
Let's go back to that.
You'll know the answer to this better than anybody else, but why? I was reading a Stephen Thomas Erlewine review, actually, of Barry Manilow's recent rock opera album, 15 Minutes, which he was favorable about. He was very positive about it.
Did you just use the words rock opera and Barry Manilow in the same
I'm
sentence?
Surprised you didn't know about this.
I'm shocked.
From last year, too.
Again,
it was recent.
I can't believe I haven't heard this.
But Stephen was positive, and
yes,
he liked it, and less about him than about Barry Manilow. why, even if he makes a critically respected rock opera, why is Barry Manilow, how did he become the byword for bad music?
I've been listening to Barry Manilow since my mother had his records on when I was probably 4 or 5 years old. It's something that I grew up with, and because it's that deeply ingrained in me, it almost defies criticism. But I had to learn how to articulate why it was at first it was a guilty pleasure, and then I just got rid of the guilt because who gives a shit. The thing with Barry Manilow, he's a soft rock, adult contemporary, easy listening type artist, but he doesn't have the same qualities as, for example, Yacht Rock, because Yacht Rock is supposed to be very smooth and maybe not always sophisticated, but there's that feeling of elegance, I guess, to a lot of it. And with Barry Manilow, you're not getting a smooth kind of elegance. You're getting melodramatic proto-power ballads a lot of the time. And then you're getting up-tempo numbers that are kind of, let's just call them awkward show tune pastiches. But I think for somebody like me who transitioned from Barry Manilow and then hit puberty and went directly into hair metal power ballads, there's definitely a commonality there. It's just that Barry Manilow has bombastic orchestrations from, strings and horns, and power ballads just have highly amplified guitars.
Both have elaborate hairstyles, too, I might add.
They both have fantastic hair. It's just that one of them plays a lot better in Vegas than the other. At least for now. I mean, I'd really like to go see Cinderella play the Caesar's Palace or wherever they're having the shows now. I think maybe in 20 years' time we'll be able to do that. Hopefully. That's what my fingers crossed.
You had that line in your bio for All Music that if I don't feel guilty about the pleasure of Barry Manilow, I have no guilty pleasures. Do you really have no guilty pleasures where music or film or any kind of media or art is concerned? Are they all simply pleasures, if indeed they are pleasures?
I'm hard-pressed to think of anything that I still feel guilty about because I don't see the point of it. Yeah. If you like something, don't just apologize. Oh, well, I like this because it's cheesy and it's bad. Like, no, fuck you. Grow a pair of balls and just say, I like Barry Manilow, and when you step away from the record player, I'm drunk enough that I'm going to go put on the Barry Manilow that you have, quote-unquote, ironically hidden in your record cabinet, and I'm going to play it really, really loud and rub it in your face.
As a side note, I mean, if somebody wants to genuinely appreciate Barry Manilow, where do you say they should start?
Barry Manilow is not what you would call an album artist. Rock operas notwithstanding. Rock operas that I need to go home and check out immediately. But the way that I got one of my friends hooked on Barry Manilow is neither of us was in any shape to drive after that night. So I said, hey, we're just going to listen to music until you're sober enough to get out of my apartment. And here's what you're going to listen to. And then you play some melodramatic Barry Manilow ballads, and you start to point out the commonalities. Like, here's the point where he's going to transition into the climactic key change at the end of the song because he does it every single time. Your intimate knowledge, of your ability to predict what Barry Manilow is going to do in a very specific way that illustrates that you have been thinking about this for a long time, coupled with the extreme melodrama of a Barry Manilow ballad, which sounds really great when you're drunk. If you're in the right frame of mind, it's just so sweeping and unsubtle. It works very well when there's nothing subtle about, for example, what you've ingested that night. Right. It just fits, and it's infectious and it's contagious, and it will take you over your soul before you know what's happened.
That guilty pleasure attitude you mentioned just a bit earlier, the sort of like, oh, this sucks, but I'll put it on, and now it's okay, and it's not an attitude that I have either, but it's one people seem to take about Los Angeles itself, about this city. It's like, oh, it's too big, it's kind of tacky, it's unsubtle, but okay. I mean, they have that same sort of attitude, and I do want to say to them, you can unironically like it. I mean, do you notice that about this city as well? People will have that kind of trying to distance themselves, trying to secretly liking it, trying to act like they don't kind of stance.
I think in all those cases, it's just that people, number one, they're not music nerd critics, so they can't necessarily articulate why they like it. And number two, the whole guilty pleasure phenomenon, I think, is just you're afraid of what other people will say if you say, yes, all those observations are correct, but that's why I like it.
You turn it right around on them.
Yes, yeah, you can. Well, yeah, Yacht Rock it's mellow. There's no edge. I don't relate to the artists. They're not auteurs. They're not. Yes, but that's why I like it. It's I don't need an edgy auteur. I don't need a provocateur like Iggy Pop to make me like music. They don't need a video image for me to like the music. They don't need all these other things. What they're doing very well. And if you, I think that's a lot of what I learned in all music, was trying to come to whatever it is on its own terms and try to tune into what that's trying to do instead of trying to impose my own judgment on it right away. Like, let's just take it in for a minute and see what kind of experience this work wants you to have, or this tremendously unsubtle city. I don't know why anybody thinks subtlety and American goes hand in hand in the first place, but it's there have been so many cultural trends, good and awful, that have come out of Los Angeles,
right.
And at some point you just want to tune into, like, where did all this come from and why?
What kind of experience in your years here, over a decade, do you think this place wants you to have?
I think this place wants to hide all the good stuff from you. That was my sense of L.A., is the better the experience you're going to have, the less L.A. wants you to know about it, because then everybody wants to do it. There's so much more competition for anything that's kind of a cool, unique experience, that the people who really have something going on and want to keep it small, they're going to move it to a building that is surrounded by hedges that you can't see in, and you have no idea anything is even there to begin with.
In a neighborhood you never heard of.
My cousin was out here visiting, and I wanted to take him. Let's tour the landmarks. Let's go drive around the site where the Playboy Mansion is. If you did not know from looking it up on the internet and pointing it at it on the map, you would have no idea that was the Playboy Mansion, because you cannot see inside for obvious reasons. And you get that same sense driving around in the hills, like up on Mulholland Drive. Like, a lot of those, the really rich places or the really fancy places are just so inaccessible, because, they don't want a bunch of slack-jawed tourists gawking at them the whole time. That they're trying to live in their house that they paid a lot of money for, that's on stilts and will be destroyed in the next earthquake. But yeah, there's so many nooks and crannies of this city that you just have no idea what's going on, either because people want it that way or because there's so much else going on that... Yeah, I feel like you're never going to run out of things to explore in L.A. The question is just, can you find out about them?
A sense of there's so much, and also that needle in a haystack kind of thing. The same thing you might find trying to keep up with music, right?
Right. Yeah. There's so much going on that it's impossible to do and see and experience everything. You just kind of have to pick and choose. Wait, that sounds good. Let's go do that. Instead of, let's narrow our options down from 200 to like 2 or 3 that we can have in the next month.
I've been speaking with Steve Huey. You've read his writing on AllMusic. You have seen him introduce Yacht Rock. You've maybe seen him on VH1 as well, counting things down. And if you haven't, you can do all those right now. Steve, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all of the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to the people backing this season, including Aidan Millman, Andy Cooney, Ben Bartley, Brian J. Dell, Doubt Us Artwork, Greg Bigelow, Greg Linster, Henry Coronan, Umberto Grant, James Faber, Jonathan McCalmont, Mark Larson, Matt Warren, Mia Muratori, Nicholas Croft, Paul Doyle, Ray McGuire, Rob Montz, Robert Foley, Roberto Medri, Samuel Hansen, Sean Dudley, Small Demons, Stephen Ingles, Steve Himmer, TSD, and Wayne Wright.